she whispered to me, "You might want to give everybody else a chance." That's what my girlfriend Hannah at the time said as I was visiting an Asian church. I didn't realize that I was the one answering all the questions while everybody else was just being quiet, listening. I later learned that in their culture, respect for the teacher was shown by listening and allowing the teacher to talk. Where for me, I was trying to show respect by being engaged and asking questions. But I realized for them that was considered maybe I didn't appear humble as I was trying to look like I was dominating the discussion. I realized that by answering all the questions, it could look like I'm trying to make other people look bad. As I got to know my girlfriend and then my wife, Hannah, I got to know more about her family background, and I saw the differences between how I was very individualistic in my orientation and how her family background was very much more collectivistic. Like, for example, they would refer to their elders with titles, uncle and auntie and things like that, and I wasn't used to some of that stuff. Like, for example, going through getting food, I would serve myself first, and then I didn't think about to serve everybody else. Yeah. But so I just realized that the cultural differences really came out a lot when we were dating. It was also a good experience because I really learned how we can also learn a lot from each other too. Cultures teach us how we fit into the world and societies around us. It teaches us how we are supposed to be as men and women. It teaches us what kinds of values we should have, how we treat our elders and the children among us. And so all these things shape us and how we ought to be. And it's good for us to know, because if you want to be effective in our relationships with people, then you might want to know some of the ways culture shapes us and be attentive to those. Also, even within the same culture, it's also important to know how people are affected differently by the culture, because it doesn't affect everybody the same way. Like if you're a man or a woman, the culture may teach you different things. So it's important for us to be attentive to how these things influence people. So the main point of the lesson today is that our behavior is also influenced by our social context, including our families and our larger culture. In this lesson, you'll describe how a behavioral approach connects your behavior with external conditioning. You'll describe major cognitive changes in development. You'll identify different ways culture contributes to behavior. And you'll describe how individual behavior is embedded in larger social and cultural context. So we're going to start with a behavioral view of human development. And then we're also going to look at other views like the cognitive and social cognitive perspectives. The behavioral views traces back to Ivan Pavlov's experiments with dogs. And in his approach, he discovered that dogs began to salivate and whenever they heard a bell or a noise that was associated with food that was given to them. And so he discovered this idea that we're conditioned into certain responses, and that was classical conditioning. So behaviorism is the view that the appropriate focus of psychology should be on observable behavior. So they were moving away from Freud's focus on unconscious forces, like we've talked about in previous chapters. But instead, they wanted to focus more on things that were observable, that could be objectively measured. Otherwise, looking at the unconscious was considered pseudo-scientific because it wasn't really falsifiable. However, behaviorists, they wanted to be a more objective science. So they looked at things that could be measured, like I said. So behaviorists sought to establish theories that were empirically validated and moved away from ideas that were not testable. So they focused more on observable behavior. Behaviorists define personality in the context, so for the purpose of this chapter, they define personality as a set of learned responses to various situations or habits. So they're looking at how things are conditioned or learned. The problem with the classical behavioral approach is that it didn't consider mental processes or the role of social influences on behavior. And that's what we're also going to look at in this chapter. Modern behaviorists now acknowledge that cognition and emotion play a role, but their emphasis is still on the impact of environment on development. So behaviorists tend to look at the role of conditioning, whether it's classical conditioning, as in the example of Ivan Pavlov's dogs that we saw, or an operant conditioning, which is about rewarding or reinforcing behavior. And we're going to discuss this more in depth in the future. So let's look at the cognitive view. That was behavioral view. Let's look at the cognitive view of human development. And this traces back to, especially with regards to personality, this was really looked at with Jean Piaget, who lived in 1896 to 1980. He was a Swiss psychologist who focused on child development. And his cognitive developmental theory is an approach that focuses on the development of thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. In this theory, people process new information by adaptation, which is a process by which organisms change so that they'll be more successful in a particular environment. In this theory, knowledge is organized into mental categories, or he called schemas or schemes, which changes individuals' growth. So let me give you an example of what a schema is. When my son was learning words, he first learned, one of the first words he learned was ball. So anytime he saw something that was round and spherical, he would call it ball, ball, ball. So that was a schema, but he over-applied that schema to everything, including oranges, apples, tomatoes, watermelons, you name it. Anything that was round, he would call a ball. And so we had to explain to them not everything is a ball. We have to teach them other words. And so that is a process by which he learned a more nuanced understanding of his different schemas. And so in some circumstances, new experiences are assimilated into existing schemes. So this is known as assimilation. But when a new object or event does not fit current experiences, this requires schemas to change, and this is known as accommodation. So it depends on how that new object fits into the old one. Is it through assimilation, which it changes the, which recategorizes the new object into and fits the old one, or is it through accommodation, which changes the old schemas? So in the case of my son who's learning new words, if he sees a new animal that he's never seen before, he might think this, like he sees a goat and all he knows is the word cow. He might assimilate that goat into his previous existing schemas and call it a cow, right? Or like he calls everything a ball, or everything's dead. On the other hand, if he starts to realize, wait a minute, these new objects or events do not fit those current experiences, he might change the old schemas, and that would be accommodation. So Piaget also discovered, or he found that there are qualitative differences in the ways children and adults think, know, and go about understanding things. And so he identified 4 stages that highlight these differences, and his focus is primarily on childhood. We have other people who've developed other stage models that go beyond childhood, but at least Piaget's focus was primarily on childhood. So Piaget's 4 stages start with the sensory motor stage. And this is from birth to 2 years. And its focus is that children are learning all about motor skills. And then the pre-operational stage, and the motor skills include things like walking and crawling and things like that. But once they've learned to walk, now children start to shift their focus to learning more about words and symbols. And that happens in toddlerhood and early childhood. And that would be called the pre-operational period. It's pre-operational because they can't quite do logical thinking, but they are able to symbolize things with words. And that's what it means by symbols, is using symbols to represent things such as words. And then from 7 to 11 years of age, that's when kids in the middle childhood phase are able to engage in concrete operations. And concrete operations are simply using the mind to complete simple logical reasoning. but not necessarily in the abstract sense, but more in the concrete sense. So they're able to understand principles of conservation, like if you transfer water from one glass that's a different size to another, that they can retain its volume. If you slice up a piece of pie into two slices, rather than having more, you just end up with a more quantity of food. You just have two slices. And whereas pre-operational kids think that if you slice up something, they think, oh wow, I have more, but they don't understand that more slices doesn't necessarily mean more food. So after concrete operations, after they're able to do that, then they're able to engage in formal operations, and this is correlates with about adolescence. And formal operations is abstract logic, which is things like math and they're able to engage in inductive and deductive reasoning using abstract logic. So social cognitive theories emphasize the importance of other people's behavior on cognitive mental processes. Now, Piaget's approach was primarily from the perspective that cognitive changes are due to biological differences in the brain that develop over time, whereas social cognitive theories emphasize how society affects our cognitive mental processes. And so in Lev Vygotsky's social cognitive theory, this emphasizes social context in which a large share of children's cognitive development takes place. People learn what is transmitted to them through the shared meaning of objects and events. So rather than assuming that all of our ability to learn words is just all about biology, Vygotsky is looking at how society shapes the meaning of words and objects. So expanding on behavioral theories of conditioning, it's believed that people can learn behaviors through interactions in the social environment. So we're going to talk about some examples of this. Social learning theory is a view that emphasizes the influence of the social behavior of others on our learning. And people learn by watching what happens to others and by remembering the consequences of past actions. So this view was advocated, the social learning theory was advocated by Albert Bandura. So remember, Vygotsky his emphasis was on the social cognitive theory. Albert Bandura's theory is about social learning. So the heading is a catch-all heading, just so you know. But social learning theory was advocated by Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura is a social learning theorist that's famous for his Bobo doll experiment. And you can see in this picture, the Bobo doll experiment was an experiment in which children were placed in a room in which an adult either modeled violent behavior or not toward a doll. They called it the Bobo doll. And so when an adult or parent or teacher figure engaged in aggressive behavior toward this doll, then children were far more likely to engage in a similar aggressive behavior toward the doll as well, without being instructed to. When the adult engaged in other forms of play, then the children did not engage in aggressive behavior. So it just showed that children are watching adults, and they do similar behaviors. They model their behavior similar to what the adults are doing. So in the study, Bandura found that children acted according to how they observed others behaving. And this is called observational learning or modeling. Another theory in the social cognitive view is the attribution theory. And this actually comes from social psychology. And it's a theory that says that humans seek to find explanations for why other people's behaviors and events occur. So we will, in this view, we either attribute negative events or outcomes to ourselves or to others in order to figure things out. And we can evaluate our behavior and either hold ourselves responsible or not responsible for the outcome. So if you think of a car accident, we tend to try to figure out why things happened. We try to come up with assumptions that explain what contributed to the accident. And we tend to think, we can either think positively or negatively about other people or ourselves. So we can attribute the cause of the behavior as either internal to oneself or external. So with regard to the self, we can attribute events to our global self or to a specific action by the self. So for example, shame tends to be results of a negative attribution to the global self. So that's one way we can think of it. So we might think of we are a bad person versus we did something wrong. And another way of looking at it is is it because we inherently are wrong or because of the environment that contributed to it? So that brings us to the social influences on personality development. So attribution theory was just simply, do we look at the social context of behavior or not? So let's look at the social influences on personality development. So we want to understand that society and cultures influence our behavior. Otherwise, we might just assume that people do good or bad things because that's how they inherently are. But that ignores the role of society. So how we view ourselves is often based on the standards, rules, and goals socially prescribed and transmitted by the culture and family to the children. And these are acquired through culturalization in a society. Acculturation is similar. That's more about how people come into a new society. But culturalization is basically how people grow up in a society, become a part of that culture, or follow the culture. So human development is embedded in a context, which is the particular setting or situation in which development occurs. So everybody belongs to a context, and that context varies from person to person. These situations include both one's own family and their larger society, which society is a larger group of individuals within which an individual lives. So the socio-cultural context is the broad context that includes both social and cultural influences. Development must be considered in the context of broadly defined socio-cultural context. So I hope you understand socio-cultural context is simply the society and culture that one lives in, and that influences our behavior. Cultural factors influence our development as well as our personality. Professor Geert Hofstede, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, developed cultural dimensions theory for analyzing cross-cultural communication. This theory describes the effects of a society's culture on the values of its members. So there's several dimensions. The first dimension is individualism versus collectivism. This refers to the degree which people emphasize I versus we. In an individualistic culture, people tend to have loose ties between individuals. People tend to focus on themselves and their immediate families only. Competition tends to predominate over cooperation. Personal achievement is typically valued more highly than group achievement, and individual freedom and expression and choice receive strong emphasis. In collectivistic cultures, people are tightly integrated into very strong in-groups, usually extended families that include relatives outside the immediate nuclear family. The group takes precedence over the individual, and cooperation and group achievement are stressed over competition and individual achievement. So in collectivistic cultures tend to be found in places like Asia and I believe South America and other places like that. United States, Western countries tend to be highly individualistic, although not all. It's not a perfect arbitrary distinction, because you can find people in the West who are also very collectivistic as well. But in general, collectivism tends to promote group harmony, but at the expense of individual freedom. Another dimension is power distance. Power distance refers to the degree to which people in a culture expect that power is hierarchical or held in the hands of parents or authorities rather than being distributed evenly. So this is about hierarchy, essentially. And in this, so in American society, we might typically think that we're less, actually, we tend to promote values of equality, and we have more egalitarian expectations. So we expect men and women to be treated the same, and organizations are typically run through empowering people rather than demanding people follow the leader necessarily. And so we might expect people at the bottom of a hierarchy to be treated roughly the same as someone near the top. And someone at the bottom in a business or someone who has less power may feel entitled to talk directly to someone in charge. Whereas in a power distance culture, people at the bottom are expected to stay there and they don't talk to people at the top and they don't give feedback to people at the top. There's no upward channels of feedback. Basically, you just do what people at the top say and that's it. And you're happy with that. And so in a culture that is more hierarchical, you don't talk back to your parents. You don't disagree with your parents. If you disagree with parents, that's considered disrespectful. And whatever the parents say goes. Same thing in a business or organizational setting. Whatever the leaders say is unquestioned. And most people in that culture understand that. They know their place typically. Which that can be hard for somebody who is more accustomed to having more say or an egalitarian emphasis on everybody being treated the same. If they go into a hierarchical culture, they may really not like that. And also, for someone who's accustomed to greater hierarchy, going into an egalitarian culture, may not know how to relate when they discover everybody's expecting to be treated the same and equally. Some cultures also put more emphasis on masculine and feminine roles. So masculinity and femininity refers to how flexible the gender roles are for men and women in their culture. So in masculine cultures, men are more assertive and competitive. You might think of them as more macho and that sort of thing. And men have to carry this role that they're strong protectors of women, that sort of thing. And women go along with that in that kind of society. Whereas in American culture, we tend to downplay, now these days at least, it may not have always been that way, but more modern times, men have more flexible roles. They may carry roles that are, they may take on motherly qualities with their children. They may be open about their affection. They may not be as afraid to show that they may not have to show that they're always strong and that sort of thing. And women are open to that too. And in some cultures, there's uncertainty avoidance. That basically means that some cultures are more tolerant of uncertainty and ambiguity for the purpose of freedom that allows people to think differently. Other cultures emphasize strict rules and laws with emphasis on security and safety, and they tend to believe that there's one correct truth. And as you would probably guess, this tends to go along with the cultures that are probably more collectivistic and more hierarchical. And that's because, in those kinds of societies, you do what you need to do to be safe. You don't necessarily talk out and do things that could, rock the boat. And so people are going to do what is the safe thing to do. And whereas other societies that put more emphasis on freedom of speech and empowering all people, they may allow for ambiguity and people who think differently. And this you can see this a lot in religion, like in churches. In some cultures, it's all about following what the church leaders say. And that would go along with the hierarchy as well. But they also see things more in black and white terms too. Whereas in other places, they might say, no, it's a little more nuanced. It's not black and white, or it's not clear cut, either or, that as people might think. So another domain of social influence looks at or uses a theory of symbolic interactionism. George Herbert Mead was the father of symbolic interactionism, which is based on the work of psychologists like William James, Charles Horton Cooley, and John Dewey. And Mead believed that an individual can never see himself without looking through, or herself, without looking through the eyes of others, by taking the role of another. By looking at oneself as an object, we gain more perspectives through the experience of social interactions. So as we talked about in the previous chapter about how people develop the sense of self, by looking at themselves through a mirror, he would say that's essential. You cannot see yourself without looking through the eyes of others. And so therefore, looking at oneself as an object, we gain more perspective through the experience of social interactions. So it's part of this, or how we are, it's part of our role in society. So this theory is about how we make meaning. So humans want to make sense of the world around them, and we make meaning through social interactions. Symbolic interactionism looks at how we import socially derived symbols into our mind. As we were talking about earlier, particularly with the social cultural context of words and symbols, we talked about the social cognitive theory and things like that. Symbolic interactionism looks at the process of how we import these socially derived symbols. So it's all about how humans are involved in this meaning-making process that is all mutual and it's negotiated. So it's a theory of sociology, really, that our whole social reality is negotiated with the individual involved in making meaning. So in contrast to other theories like attribution theory, that comes from social psychology, symbolic interactionism is a sociological theory. It's more focused on not the individual, but looking at how individuals as a group, or as how humanity is involved in making meaning through mutual interactions. And so Mead believed that humans use commonly shared symbols to survive and adapt to a changing world. So the focus is on how people construct reality through interactions. While the self has free agency, is limited by the roles one subscribes to, which defines a set of symbols, beliefs, and attitudes which governs one's position in society. So, for example, we might think about how a person who is maybe a woman or a man, or a person who is a parent, or a person who is a teacher or has an authority figure in society, their roles are going to define how their attitudes and beliefs that govern how they position themselves in society. So just by nature of being born a man or a woman, for example, is going to influence how the language they use. And an example of that is that in some cultures, men and women use different languages. They use different vocabularies. And so just by the nature of who you are, it shapes the language you use. And I hope that makes sense. So that goes beyond the previous theories that just talks about how society plays a role. Symbolic interactionism says that your whole role in society influences the words you use and how you shape the way you see the world. It shapes how you define things and how you describe things. So that brings us to the last section of systemic theories. In systems theories or approaches, they attempt to integrate theories by providing a broader focus. So as we talked about, we were looking at things from a sociological perspective. Systems theories also attempt to look at humans in the context of a larger in a larger context, in a larger society or culture, or family even. So system theory suggests that we must study events within the context of how relationships are organized and the patterns of interactions between people. So what is a system? A system is a metaphor that describes people as being organized and interdependent, where changes in one part of the system will ultimately affect other parts of the system and can be met with resistance. So what is an example of a system? In the most common system that we all know of, personally, is a family. We're all part of a family. We wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for somebody taking care of us as we were growing up. And so that family could be anybody, really. It doesn't have to be biological parents, but we all have somebody or some people that we belong to typically, even if it's a caseworker or somebody. But there's a system that everybody belongs to. And then outside of that family, we have schools that we belong to, because most of us grow up in a school. We go to school for education. And then we have churches that people go to. We have civic organizations. There are gangs that people can belong to. And they can be good or bad. There's lots of kind of systems that people belong to. And then there's also extended families, I forgot to mention. So we have nuclear families, but we also have extended families as well. So in systems, relationship patterns are assumed to have a circular causality rather than linear causality. And that's because causality in a system is circular. What is causality? It basically means A causes B, but that would be linear. Linear causality says A causes B. Circular causality says that A causes B, that causes A, causes B, it causes A, and back and forth. And there's no beginning. So because causality in a system is circular, no one person is assumed to cause the behavior of another. Instead, each person is assumed to contribute to each other in a circular feedback loop. So basically, and when I work with couples and families, I try to find out how conflict began. But oftentimes, there's really no beginning point. It just, we bring out the worst in each other. And, you can't really blame one person necessarily sometimes. Although in some cases where people abuse power, we might want to try to blame an abuser, for example. But in a system, typically, oftentimes, things bring out the worst in each other. So, for example, in the larger society, we have liberals and conservatives, and we have the polarization of the political parties in our society. And rather than blaming necessarily one party or one side for being bad, what we might say is we might look at how one party elicits a response from the other party. So people may inadvertently self-reinforce their own negative experiences and how negative emotions spread contagiously throughout a system. So, for example, let's say you are anxious about somebody leaving you. You might cling and control that person, which leads that person to want to leave you. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And also, our emotions sometimes spread through to other people. So if you're anxious, someone else is going to be anxious, and vice versa. So systems can also get stuck in homeostasis. That's a system's need to maintain stability. So if somebody does something different and they change radically, then the rest of the system is going to try and compensate and pull that person back into maintain some kind of normalness. Like, for example, let's say you have a child who or a member of a family decides they don't want to go to church anymore. Well, the rest of the family is going to try to get that member to go back to church. And why is that? Well, there's definitely, it creates, it off balances everybody. Everybody's kind of like, whoa, wait, how do we maintain this normalcy, what they're used to? Another thing that might change is, let's say somebody pulls away and they distance themselves from the rest of the family. Well, that's going to hurt the rest of the family. They're going to want to try and maintain some normalcy, so they're going to try and pull that person back in. or they might do other things to counterbalance it. And that is homeostasis. So there are different levels of systems too, we should also notice, as I alluded to before. So, I mentioned families, and then there's extended families. But then if we look at it like as a level, then those families are part of a larger society that's a larger system. So systems behavior affects the external environment, and the external environment also influences the system. So we don't want to look at, just as we don't look at individuals as living in a vacuum, we also want to look at how families also don't exist in a vacuum either. Families operate in a society, and that society influences the family, and just as they influence society. So that brings us to Urie Bronfenbrenner, who developed the social ecological or ecological systems theory. Bronfenbrenner was a Russian-American psychologist who focused on child development. As he was helping the U.S. government with the Head Start program in 1965, he found that a child's genetic endowment interacted with the social environment to influence his or her trajectory of development in life. So before this, people would think, everything is genetic, and therefore some people who are, not developing well, they would just blame it on their genes, that some people are just inferior, right? But Bronfenbrenner helped people to understand that, genes don't explain everything. Genes also interact with the environment, and the environment also plays a role. So if people, like for example, if you live in a poor neighborhood where there's less access to resources, you're also going to have some delays due to that too. You can have the best genes in the world, but if you live in a bad area, that's also going to play a role as well. And so usually you have a combination of the two that affect development. So Bronfenbrenner developed ecological systems theory. And as you can see in the diagram, it has multiple levels of systems. First, you have the individual at the base of it. So you have the individual's own biological system, we should mention. An individual, they have their own genes and their own biology that plays a role. But above that, then there's the microsystem. This is the local group. These are the local groups that affect a person the most, such as their family, church, school, neighborhood, and peers. I would put family is a nested level right even below that, but Bronfenbrenner includes it in the microsystem. Then we have the mesosystem. Meso literally means, I believe it's Greek, but it literally means in between. So this refers to the connections between the microsystems, such as the family and the school teachers. So for example, your family is interacting with the school system, the school teachers. They go to, they might see each other at the PTA or in the community, and so these would be the mesosystem. Then you have the exosystem. The exo literally means outside, and so this refers to the people outside of our sphere of influence who can still have an impact on us. This would include, industries, mass media, local politics, neighbors, our social services. They can still have an immediate impact on us, even though they're not technically in our sphere of influence. Then there's the macro system. So the macro system refers to the larger culture or society in which we live. This includes attitudes and ideologies of the larger culture. For example, if the larger culture emphasizes equality or freedom of expression, then individuals in that culture may feel more entitled to express their freedoms or express their opinions. On the other hand, if society puts a lot of emphasis on gender roles, then individuals in that society may feel more pressure to comply with what it means to be stereotypically masculine or feminine. The next level is the chronos system. Chronos is a Greek word that literally means time or seasons of life. And so in this view, development interacts with the timeline of life. For example, if you're an adolescent, you may be more concerned with your identity, like Erik Erikson talks about. Or if you're a young adult, your emphasis may be more on intimacy and relationships. Middle adults may be more more concerned about generativity, for example. And so the point of life you're in is going to affect your development as well. And so that's the chronos system. So let's look at how does nature and nurture interact and how do we integrate them? Urie Bronfenbrenner and Stephen Ceci later proposed the bioecological model. They added the individual's own biology and genes as the lowest level of systems. And I believe that they felt they needed to put more emphasis on the role of genes because the diagram that I previously showed you didn't really emphasize it as much as it probably could. So this emphasizes that human development is a dynamic, interactive process that begins with an individual's genetic endowment and unfolds over time as a result of interaction with the various levels of the environment, from the smaller levels, such as a family, to the larger levels of society. So the lifespan development approach emphasizes 6 core ideas. First, human development is lifelong. That means we're always changing, we're always growing or dying. We're not static. Humans are constantly developing. And even when we're older, we're always learning new things. And so we're constantly growing, or constantly developing in some way. Whether, if not physically, we could also be growing mentally as well. So that brings us to the second point. Development is multidimensional. That includes both nature and nurture. We are developing not only physically, but we're also developing emotionally, mentally, cognitively, spiritually, in many different ways. The third point is that development is multidirectional and involves both losses and gains. So, just as we might think we're always growing, but as I said, we may be losing abilities as well as we get older. So the fourth point is that development is plastic. Plastic basically means flexible and changeable. So development varies from one person to the next. Your diet, whether you decide to exercise, all these things is going to influence, how you change, how you grow. Are you going to like for example, between my twin brother and I, we might have the same DNA, and we may have the same trajectory biologically, but the choices we make are going to influence how we turn out as well. It's going to influence our quality of life and how we live long or not as well. The fifth point is that development is context dependent and historically and culturally embedded. So for example, how society, the messages of society, also historically, like for example, if you lived during a recession or if you lived during a economically prosperous time, those are also going to influence whether you have resources to take care of yourself, or and also it's going to affect the culture as well. Whether you're going to feel entitled to get your needs met, or if you're going to put your needs on the back burner. And the last point is that the study of lifespan development is multidisciplinary. That means we're going to look at how people change, how people change are looked at by various different disciplines. We've seen social psychology, sociology. There's also been anthropology. There's also, other fields as well. Even philosophy, historians, they're all interested in how people change and grow throughout their lifespan. So in conclusion, we've seen some theories on how society and the environments around us shape us to be the way we are. We've looked at some behavioral theories, and we've looked at some social and cognitive theories of development. And we see that humans develop throughout the lifespan, and we've seen how the context in which we're embedded in, the society, interacts with our development. And it's important to be aware of that. Nobody lives in a vacuum. We're always interacting with our environment, and that includes our family, the churches we go to, schools that we go to, even the larger society and the government that we are under. All these have messages that shape how we ought to be raised. So, for example, if you encounter people, you're trying to have good relationships with people, then you might want to know, you might want to be sensitive to the fact that your experience may be different from theirs. And so, just because of the culture you're in, everybody's treated differently, the cultures interact differently with people. And then we have different cultures that we're coming from too. So within and outside, we all have different experiences. So that's something to be mindful of as we try to have healthy, effective relationships with people around us. So that brings us to a spiritual perspective. The question I want to ask is, are you a chameleon or are you a butterfly? A chameleon and a butterfly both go through amazing changes, but in very different ways. A chameleon can change its skin color to fit in with its surroundings as a form of camouflage. Nevertheless, this change is superficial and temporary, and the reptile is essentially the same. Meanwhile, a caterpillar larvae can spin a cocoon around itself and then completely change into a colorful butterfly in a process called metamorphosis. We may also experience changes in our lives too, but is it the change of a chameleon or of a butterfly? In the previous chapter, we talked about the need for transformation. However, the Apostle Paul contrasts transforming with conforming. He writes, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." We've talked about testing God in a previous chapter, but here it says that we cannot really test him if we have not allowed our minds to be renewed. But what does Paul mean by this, and how is transforming, which comes from a Greek word similar to metamorphosis, different from conforming? Kenneth Burdick makes a historical observation that helps us understand the difference. The early Christian church in Rome also experienced a very drastic change, but was it conformity or transformation? Early followers of Christ were primarily Jews, and their gatherings were culturally Jewish. However, before Paul wrote his letter to the Christians in Rome around 57 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from Rome. Thus, it led to a cultural change with Gentiles leading the churches in Rome. So when Paul wrote his letter, Christian Jews were returning, but because of the ban against ethnic Jews, it led to pressure for Christian Jews to identify either as Christian or as Jew, and so they would rather identify as Christian because Jews faced persecution. Yet because of the political environment that was hostile towards Jews, there were power struggles and cultural clashes between Gentile and Jewish Christians. So Paul's message is particularly relevant to us today. In the United States, Christians are also undergoing a cultural clash between those who identify as liberal or as conservative. There are clashes over immigration and race. And the question remains for us, will we be like chameleons or like butterflies? Shall we be conformed to the social and political culture around us and fit in? Or shall we be transformed completely and go against the world and be agents of change? So we want to renew our minds. If we want to be agents of change, then we must be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That means we need to crowd out the influence of the society and culture around us so that we can move against the constant social pressure to conform. Instead, we surround ourselves with positive influences from Jesus through studying his messages and associating with a positive, transformative community of believers that challenges us to grow. Over time, we will find this influence making a difference in our lives. As Ellen White writes, "When Christ is cherished in the heart, his likeness will be revealed in the life. Humility will reign where pride was once predominant. Submission, meekness, patience will soften down the rugged features of a naturally perverse, impetuous disposition. Love to Jesus will be manifested in love to his people. It is not fitful, not spasmodic, but calm and deep and strong. The life of the Christian will be divested of all pretense, free from all affectation, artifice, and falsehood. It basically means putting on a fake image. It is earnest, true, sublime. Christ speaks in every word. He is seen in every deed. The life is radiant with the life of an indwelling Savior. In converse with God and in happy contemplation of heavenly things, the soul is preparing for heaven and laboring to gather other souls into the fold of Christ. Our Savior is able and willing to do for us more than we can ever ask or even think. How will we get to this though? How do we, we have to, it's not something we can just will to happen. We have to allow ourselves to be transformed. And she continues on, whatever your disposition may be, God is able to so mold that disposition that it will be sweet and Christ-like. By living faith, you can separate from everything not in accordance with the mind of God, and thus bring a heaven into your life here below. Will you do this? If you do, you will have sunshine at every step. I think that's a beautiful promise. She writes in a separate letter, manuscript 91. This is a hope that, some of us think that we're, that somehow we're doomed or cursed to always be negative. But God promises that He can transform us and make us happy. I used to think that other people always had a smile on their face. They're just too chipper, or maybe they're just faking it. But then deep down inside, I think I envied their happiness. And so I realized, why can't I? Why can't I be happy and cheerful like that? It's only through allowing God to come into my life and to allow Him to soften the hard edges have I been able to experience that in my own life as well. Another good news here is that Christ unites us in our diversity. Sometimes we just want to fit in, right? And we think that conformity is the solution. But it's not conformity that unites us. It's Christ who unites us in our diversity. Going back to what Paul writes about, Paul was addressing conflict due to power struggles and cultural clashes between the Gentile and Jewish Christians in Rome. And it seems that the antidote to this kind of strife is the transformation into Christ's character. But rather than forcing people to be like us or to worship like us, which is conformity, and I hate to say a lot of people out there think that's a solution. Instead, Christ's loving character brings harmony and unity in our diversity. Ellen White writes this, every association of life calls for the exercise of self-control, forbearance, and sympathy. We differ so widely in disposition, habits, and education that our ways of looking at things vary. We judge differently. Our understanding of truth, our ideas in regard to the conduct of life are not in all respects the same. There are no two whose experience is alike in every particular. The trials of one are not the trials of another. The duties that one finds light are to another the most difficult and perplexing. Rather than judging people for being different, we can celebrate our differences because this diversity is evidence of the strength of our love for each other. And I think that's a beautiful promise. Rather than expecting other people to be the same as us, we should celebrate our differences. And she writes in another place, she writes this, marked diversities of disposition and character frequently exist in the same family. It's interesting, we talk about genetic traits, we've talked about inheritance, but here she talks about differences even in the same family. For it is in the order of God that persons of varied temperament should associate together. When this is the case, each member of the household should sacredly regard the feelings and respect the right of the others. Harmony may be secured, and the blending of the varied temperaments may be a benefit to each. Let me just share with you a story. I used to live with my sister a long time ago. We bought a house together when I was in college, and she wanted to put up pink curtains that was given to her. And I was thinking, I don't want pink curtains in my house. That would be very feminine. And I remember saying, no, I don't want your pink curtains up. And she said, and I think it just made her cry. And she was like, I thought, she was just really upset. And so one day I said, you know what, if you want your pink curtains up, that's fine. I want you to be happy. And then she cried and she said, you know what, it means a lot that you want me to be happy. And because of that, I don't really need it anymore. It's not that big of a deal. I think only when we love others and put ourselves aside and care about others, then we can truly experience that happiness in our relationships. And I think that only comes through allowing Christ. I would say a lot of people are happy and peaceful out there, but really, if we want to experience genuine, deep metamorphosis or change, that can come by allowing God to come into our lives and to recreate us from the inside out, and allows us to put away our own selfish expectations that are oftentimes just trying to conform to society, what other people expect of us. But when we put those things aside, then we can genuinely experience change and find happiness and peace in our lives. So that's all. And I hope you can join us for our next chapter on your good side as we talk about beauty and character. I hope you can join us as we continue on this journey of higher change. Thank you.